Hey, Lucy.
What's up, Tim?
In the movie Testament, a mother tries to keep her family together in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. As the father of a new baby who grabs everything within arm's reach and throws it on the ground, I too think I understand the value of arms control.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear counterproliferation for a living. I am joined today in the podcast studio / Zoom with Lucy Steigerwald, contributing editor of antiwar.com and former podcast guest from our fun episode on the Fallout video game series. Lucy, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. This is going to be way less fun.
Yeah, glad it's a lot less interactive because the movie Testament is not one that I feel like immersing myself in.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Longtime listeners would remember you from this Fallout video game series episode, like a 3-hour long marathon through all of the different Fallout video games. We're not going to go that long this time around, but I'm glad you're back because of your great work you've done on the Stag blog. Your blog have a particular project. Is it called the Apocalypse Project, where you review nuke movies and other kinds of apocalyptic media?
Yeah, that's what I started calling it, and I've left it by the wayside writing-wise for a while, but I have a lovely backlog of video games, books, and movies that I need to get back to. I guess technically I was doing all apocalypses, but nukes are kind of my favorite. Like you, I would say.
Well, 2020 is the year to get these kind of projects back up and running. And one of the ones that you did write on is one of the movies we're here to talk about today, which is the 1983 movie Testament, which I didn't know this started as a PBS TV movie, but people liked the script, so it got a little bit more money. We're not talking a lot of money here. We're still under $1 million, but it got a limited release in the theaters during the same year where it was pretty popular to have a movie about nukes. That year, you had The Day After on television as a big TV movie event that people still talk about today that scared Ronald Reagan and convinced a ton of people in the nuclear nonproliferation field to get into this line of work. You've got Silkwood with Meryl Streep about a nuclear radiation accident. You've got Special Bulletin, another TV movie that we've covered on the podcast. And also War Games, which everybody has seen, even if you're not a nuclear war enthusiast. So this is the story of your average family trying to survive a nuclear attack. This seems like the plot of a lot of movies that we've covered on the podcast, but this time there's no mushroom cloud. There's no blast damage. It's just a struggle to stay alive, to stay civil, good to your neighbors, and the family trying to deal with radiation sickness, isolation, and which I think is one of the strongest pieces of the movie, the crippling uncertainty about what's happening and whether or not that will tear apart their community and their family. Why did you want to come on and talk about this one?
Okay, so this one is one of the more upsetting movies I have ever seen. More upsetting the first time around. At some point years and years ago, my mom could not remember the title of this movie, but we like to talk about depressing historical things, depressing fiction a lot.
Thanksgiving's right around the corner. That'll be fun.
She was like, there's this movie where there's like a mom trying to take care of her kids and there's like a nuclear war and it's just really, really sad. I remember she said that. And then a couple of years later, I was like, Mom, remember that it's called Testament. And this was when I was already on my weird self-study on these things, which was kicked off by actually watching On the Beach with my parents. This one I sometimes get annoyed by sort of apocalypse movies where you don't know anything that happened, because sometimes there's this contrivance. But this one really works, I think, the lack of knowledge does.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people in lab coats explaining what's going on, or there's no very stirring speech by the President of the United States or saying, here's what's happening and here's why we're doing what we're doing. No, it's just, imagine you're living your average life and then all of a sudden you're cut off from everything and you just don't really know what's going on, which is probably how a lot of people would experience it. And I think that's what drew the director and writer of this movie, Lynn Littman, to this. You pointed out to me something I didn't know either, that this is actually based on a short story called Our Last Testament by Carol Amen. This was published in Miss Magazine in August 1981, and I guess the director read this story with her son and just kind of had to direct it. She's also this director. She won an Academy Award for her documentary short Number Our Days in 1976, so she's pretty well capable of kind of handling something like this. I thought she did a pretty good job. Well, this also's got a pretty good amount of people in this movie who've got a really strong talent for portraying these kinds of things. Why don't you talk about some of the people that are in this movie?
Well, I mean, the most distracting is Kevin Costner, because he's obviously the most known commodity, but he has a small upsetting part as a young father in this, and he does a very good job. Another one of those movies where I almost wish that nobody was recognizable at all, because I'm trying to think of a comparison.
Well, maybe it's because we are not in the United Kingdom, but I know the movie Threads, which covers this ground pretty well. There's a lot of people that are from different kind of soap operas in the United Kingdom, but in general, it's a lot of actors that you would not necessarily, if you was an American audience, know who they were. I think that's pretty effective.
Meanwhile, The Day After has Steve Guttenberg. I mean, The Day After is still upsetting, but Steve Guttenberg and John Lithgow or someone, no.
Yeah, it's got a bunch of people from different you'd see them and you'd be like, oh yeah, that's that guy from that TV show or that movie. And that's very distracting. Like, it's really hard to take serious what's going on when you're like, I saw you in Police Academy.
Well, yeah, I know. Something about Steve Guttenberg just seems like a... But I mean, I started with that and I thought it was very upsetting until I saw Threads and Testament. I think Testament and Threads are kind of warring for most upsetting nuclear movie from different avenues, because Threads is like hitting you over the head with a bat, and Testament's like squeezing your arm until it falls off or something.
This is good. Let's save this stuff for the end, because I want to make sure people know, because if they haven't never seen Testament, but they've seen Threads because we mentioned it on the podcast. I'm very sorry that if you watched Threads because I recommended it.
That is an apology movie.
I don't want that on my conscience. But the other people that are good in this movie, Jane Alexander is the star. She plays Carol, the mom. She's a 4-time Academy Award nominee, including for this movie, Kramer versus Kramer. She's got a part in All the President's Men, and another good movie. I can't remember the name of it, but she's pretty good. Particularly good in this movie. William Devine plays the dad. Not in the movie a lot, but he's very center in terms of the story. The other thing I know him for is he played President James Heller in the 24 TV series.
Oh.
And we've got a bunch of really good child actors. A lot of good supporting cast members. Not people that have gone on to do, huge... It's not like Drew Barrymore or Leo DiCaprio kind of child actor to big star role, but they are really good in this movie.
Yeah, I think the youngest kid maybe did the most... He actually looked the most familiar to me of the kids, and he's, I think, had a decent career. He played Ryan White, the kid who died of AIDS, like a TV movie about him, I think, a couple of years after this.
Ooh, this kid just can't catch a break.
Yeah, right? I was thinking that.
Yikes. Well, so according to Box Office Mojo, it's always good to kind of figure out where we like these movies in our new policy working community, and then for you, the interest of it being from the pop culture, media, film, TV analysis piece. It's always good to see maybe as this movie didn't connect well with the broader audience. Well, at least according to Box Office Mojo, this movie made around $2 million at the box office with only $750,000 budget. That is so small. So it's pretty decent return. It didn't have a huge release in terms of like number of theaters. It gets an 82% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes with an audience score of 74. So it seems like the movie is fairly well received by critics and by people who watch it. 74 sounds about right to me.
For audience, yeah, because they would. I mean, critics, that's almost a little low for critics.
Yeah, you would think it'd be higher. I don't think there's a lot of critics on Rotten Tomatoes in terms of like the number of people that have reviewed it, or at least have submitted their reviews. It's only like 11 or 12. So let's get into the discussion here about the episode itself. And while we do, I have two main questions I wanted to kind of think about while we go through this. The first one is, how effective is a movie about nuclear war that doesn't really show any of the usual movie cues, shorthand, that we tend to see? Mushroom clouds, explosions. Can you still tell a movie about nuclear war without any of those traditional signposts, shorthand stuff? And secondly, what would it take for a movie like this to have a similar impact, at least on how it did on us today? What would it be like? What would the after story have to be? So let's run through the plot of the movie. As usual, spoiler warning, if you haven't seen this movie from 1983, it is available Not on. I've seen it available for renting on different streaming sites like Amazon Prime. It's pretty cheap DVD if you want to get it. I think it's like around $10 or so. I don't know how you ended up watching it.
I rented it on Amazon. I swear it was briefly on Prime and then went back to being a pay one. Especially if you're going to watch it once, which you probably only will. It's certainly worth $3.
There are definitely times in at least American history the last couple of years where there'll be a peak of concern about nuclear weapons, and then all of the movies that are about nuclear war will get on Amazon Prime for free streaming as part of that service. Like for a while, I saw like war games and a bunch of I saw Threads at one point on there for free streaming, and every once in a while that kind of stuff pops in and it goes away. So I usually use that as my metric for how anxious people are.
Yeah, that's fair. That probably is pretty telling.
All right, so let's go into the movie itself. I'll start us off and then throw it your way.
It was a day like any other. Televisions glowed, radios blared. Breakfasts were being served. Children were playing. Everything was as it should be. When suddenly, it could never be that way again.
So the movie opens on the Weatherly family. They're your typical nuclear family living in the suburbs of a fictional town of Hamlin, California, which I take to be just right outside of San Francisco. I think at one point I saw someone mentioned that it's like an hour and a half outside of the city, outside of the Bay Area. You got mom, whose name is Carol. You got dad, whose name is Tom, and you've got two sons, one younger one named Scotty, and one older one, a bit older, named Brad. I kind of take him to be, like 11, 10, maybe a little bit older than that. I'm terrible with children's ages.
I'm actually really terrible at it too, and I blame homeschooling and TV. I'm going to say more like 13 or 14 with him.
There is an older daughter named Mary Liz, and I take her to, I guess she could be like 15, 16. That all kind of works out.
Something, yeah, in the neighborhood of those.
The music's very uplifting. It's kind of like a bit of a Hallmark TV movie. You think, I wonder what the story's going to be about. Because it's just a family running through their normal, everyday concerns. They get a lot done before they have to get to school. As someone who struggles these days just to get the kid to daycare before starting telework, I don't know how they have the energy for all this stuff. They're cleaning the house, they're feeding the kids, they're getting ready for Scotty's school play, which is going to be a production of the Pied Piper story. They're talking about running out of toilet paper, forgetting their wallets before they leave the house. One of the main scenes is that, I guess, the dad and Brad go on a bike ride every morning because the dad is a real exercise enthusiast, really wants his son to be able to do this bike ride up this really steep hill. Brad's not able to do it that morning, but the dad's like, okay, well, you go back and I'll just keep going on my route.
Yeah, the dad's a little overbearing.
They're talking about what they're going to get Brad for his birthday, even though it's like a bunch of months away, and whether or not Brad's going to be ready for the draft, and but that's several years ago. But it's just a lot of anxieties being thrown at you, but it's nothing existential dread, nothing particularly worrying. But, it's the kind of worries you would have as that part of that family. I think the one thing I wanted to mention is that the dad, at some point on his bike ride, meets these guy named Mike and his son Hiroshi. It's a dad and son that run a gas station nearby, and they're making some plans for the weekend to go fishing. What about Carol? What's Carol up to that morning?
Carol is kind of run ragged, it seems like. And there's I think there's some nuance. There's some nice nuance with her and Tom where there's love, but she's getting a little chronically annoyed with him. I don't know, she's kind of not getting the help she needs, or there's it sounds like we're about ready for mom giving a listen, I need some more help around the house, or I need a date with you, husband, just pay more attention. It just feels like that's what we would have been leading to in the boring suburban life that these poor characters deserve to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. The dad basically has all this time in the morning to go on a bike ride, put on a suit to go to work, and while the mother has all of this other stuff that they have to do, including getting ready for Scotty's school play, Mary Liz playing the piano, all kinds of stuff. And I guess the reason why they're putting on this Pied Piper play is because the name of the town is called Hamlin, which I don't know the Pied Piper story all that well to that level of detail. The story takes place in Hamlin, United Kingdom, Hamlin something. But that's why they're telling that particular story, it sounds like, anyways.
Well, that makes sense. I didn't even notice the town name.
But at the end of the day, everybody's kind of sitting around trying to watch television. The TV's not working. And I think they're trying to watch some Sesame Street or some cartoons or something. And there's too much static on the bunny ears. So Brad's like hanging out the window trying to get the antenna working again. And then Mom is listening to the answering machine on a little tape thing, and Dad leaves a message saying, hey, he's gonna probably be late for dinner. Then later on he says, actually, no, I'm gonna be able to make it. I'm excited to see you all, but he's still like an hour away. He's not home yet. And then suddenly, this is where the movie becomes a nuke movie, right? The TV news breaks on. There's a newscaster pretty quickly and frantically saying,
this is San Francisco. We have lost our New York signal. Radar sources confirm the explosion of nuclear devices there in New York and up and down the East Coast. Ladies and gentlemen, this is real. This is...
There's an official emergency broadcast that tells people to stay at home and don't use the telephone because emergency services are going to need the telephone. What happens? The telephone rings and Carol immediately picks it up. I think she's talking to her mother and says, hey, Mom, I don't know what's going on. And then we get our big, bright, yellow flash outside the window. Carol grabs the kids and everybody gets down, ducks and covers. In the windows, yeah. And this is really the only special effect really in the movie. And this is traditionally where we would hear things like, well, there are some sirens. I think we hear a little bit, some air raid sirens. But the window glass doesn't break. We don't get the usual cues. There's no mushroom cloud. There's no flash and things catching on fire. There's not even really smoke or anything going on. Because it sounds like the town itself of Hamlin was not hit by a nuclear weapon, because it wasn't a strategic target or anything, but it's close enough to San Francisco where it must have received some kind of flash or something. But anyways, people felt what was happening. I think in the short story they mentioned an earthquake, and that's always scary to someone in California, even when it's not nuclear related. This is it. And then kind of life returns a little bit back to normal. The families they pour out into the street, and they start asking each other what's happening and if everyone's okay. And this is where we meet Kevin Costner. You want to talk a little bit about what Kevin Costner's up to at this point?
He doesn't do a lot these days, Kevin Costner, but he's still sort of distracting because most people are going to be either vaguely or not at all familiar with our main cast, and suddenly the guy that was one of the bigger movie stars, decade or two ago, suddenly pops up as a ridiculously young, brand new father. Him and I guess his wife have a new baby, which I suppose the viewer should immediately know is a bad sign, but maybe they don't quite know yet what kind of movie they're watching.
Yeah, and I think this might have gotten Kevin Costner excited for doing apocalypse movies, right? He's done Between Waterworld, which is a bit of a climate change story, and then you've got the Postman. Is that what the name of that movie is?
Yeah, that's based on a David Brin novel that I vaguely meant to read. I think I have a Kindle of that.
Is that nuclear at all? I've seen it, but I can't read.
That's a good question. I mean, that's very post-apocalyptic, and it's like all I can think of is like there's like a Gilmore Girls dialogue referencing it about how like Kevin Costner tells us once there was something called the mail. So like I don't.
Oh, it's probably just that movie came out a little bit too soon. Could come out these days. It would be pretty telling. So yeah, I mean, Kevin Costner is funny in this movie because I bet if there was a re-release of the DVD, it would say Jane Alexander, Kevin Costner, star in.
It totally would. You're right.
Yeah. He's not really in this too much. So everyone's outside. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Tom is still not back yet, but Carol tells the kids he's probably on his way, right? It's still daylight. Maybe he's still on his way, but power is out pretty much everywhere. It's unclear if it's the electromagnetic pulse that's always in these kinds of movies, which can short circuit electrical items, or it could just simply be that power is out because a lot of the places where the power plants were, which would be the targets, have been destroyed. The neighborhood really goes to one of the local leaders in the community, Mr. Abhart. Him and his wife, Rosemary, they get together. They have an old transistor radio, so he's like an old ham radio guy, unoperated. His wall, I love his wall. It's got a bunch of like different call signs from all around the United States. So he's clearly into this community of talking around on the transistor radio. It looks like cities all around the country are suffering from the EMP. Seattle, San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, all of the Southern California, which is where I grew up, is kind of sad to mention. He says basically everything's out. He can't get a hold of anybody there.
At some point, he says he can't reach anything east of somewhere,
Keokuk,
Chicago
Iowa.
or something. Oh yeah, okay.
I've been to Keokuk, Iowa.
So basically, we're in trouble, all of us in the U.S.
But it sounds like at this point the community is they're talking about going to be able to support each other. Abhart and his wife mentioned that they can always be a point of contact for everybody. They're going to get some outside, news. We'll bring it in. They have a lot of food. They're willing to share the food and organize kind of a community response. So it sounds like at least people are willing to assist and help everyone. It's not like immediately there's looting and riots and fire and all kinds of chaos breaks out. This community of people that know each other pretty well are still basically at this point trying to kind of keep everything together.
Which I like to see because I'm an optimist, but I always think there should be more immediate upset. I mean, you expect almost that this movie's going to have at least some like looting and a little more sort of bad panicked behavior, and there's a little bit, but it's a very small amount.
It gets there. I think you want to start happy, and then I guess you get the contrast of how things get worse a little bit later. But anyways, I wanted to point out here, since you got me reading the short story, which I think it's very effective. It's only around 11 pages or so. Here's how the short story describes the nuclear attack. So this whole thing is written like a journal that Carol's writing throughout this process. It's somewhat alluded to in the movie where she says she's journaling, and you see her a few times writing stuff down, and then you don't really see it later, but it seems to be the kind of narrative thread for it here. And so this is the journal entry for the nuclear attack scene. March 23rd. Tonight, as I fixed dinner and wrestled with self-pity because Tom had phoned saying he'd be late in San Francisco, the entire eastern seaboard was wiped out. I had the TV on in the kitchen, tuned to the evening news from New York. When the video went off there was a bright pop, and the screen went dark. I moved to jiggle the knobs, expecting the usual apology about technical difficulties. Although now that I think about it, the sound was off too. No static, no flickers, nothing. Suddenly, the picture came back, with an excited San Francisco announcer shouting, "Listen, listen, we're being attacked." The voice rose and broke. Radar sources confirm many eastern cities have already been destroyed. The East, I thought, panic rising in my throat. My brother's Atlanta home, Mary Liz and Brad, our older children, stared at me and the television. If only Tom were here, maybe he could tell us it was a stunt, some Orson Welles trick for an audience reaction. But as I looked at the TV crew, I knew it was no prank. The announcer was hysterical. Over and over we could hear, massive retaliation, and then the same flash on the screen, only this time we could see it all around us. An eerie light coursed and flickered hideously. "Tom," I screamed. Tom was at San Francisco. Pretty good short story. I like the way that they describe the panic nature of it, but also these are the kind of the thoughts you would have going in your head. You wouldn't be thinking about, Soviet-U.S. Relationships and strike zones and mega deaths, and you wouldn't be breaking out your calculator trying to figure out what type of blast radius and bomb damage you might be getting. You're just kind of concerned of, Eastern Seaboard, what do I know about that? My family. My family is there. I see a flash outside. Oh gosh, is that my family? Is that my husband? Is that someone else that I know? Mom's continuing to journal in the movie. Now it's a couple days later. The kids start complaining about some things, right? Like the dishes, things have dirt on them, they describe. Yeah. Mom wipes it off. I mean, you've been watching enough these kinds of movies to know what that is, right?
Well, yeah, I don't remember if I immediately caught that the first time. I certainly did this time. Dirt. It's not regular dirt.
Yeah, probably fallout. It is dirt. It's probably also a mix of concrete and whatever else was caught up in the explosion, if it was a detonation that was near the ground, and they pushed all of that stuff up into the air, into the sky, and it has to fall, and it sounds like Hamlin is in the fallout zone, and that means that all of that dirt is exposed to very small particles of radioactive material that's the byproduct of one of these detonations, where you detonate nuclear material in each one of these little specks. If you eat it, you consume it, if you get it on your skin, if you're exposed to it for long periods of time, some pretty nasty stuff can happen to your cells. Scotty complains that the milk tastes bad, which is a pretty bad sign. Mom thinks it's probably because the fridge is not working anymore. But then Brad, of course, he must have seen something on TV or maybe in one of his classes they talked about this. But he says that radiation can get into cows, right? So then that's why Mom thinks that they're just going to drink powdered milk and the other stuff that Dad had put away for camping trips.
Yeah, the cow thing, I mean, I guess that makes future milk kind of not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I was also distracted by wondering why, if the milk is warm, they're drinking it, because do you really want like food poisoning at a time like this? You know, if it's
It's one of those things, because they're not living in rubble, they still have to try to keep as much of a semblance of their normal life as they can, right? They're thinking maybe this is like a big earthquake. It's a big natural disaster. It sucks that San Francisco's gone, but we're okay, right? So let's just kind of keep life together as long as we can until help from somewhere comes in. It's kind of my sense of it anyways.
Oh, I agree. I'm just being pedantic when I think like if I was trying to keep up normal life, I'd throw out the gross milk, definitely.
Well, kids like milk, right? And this is one of those things that radioactive material getting into milk was and continues to be, but really was a huge point in the anti-nuclear movements in the 50s and the 60s. Strontium-90, which is a byproduct, radioactive isotope that comes out of a nuclear detonation, or any nuclear reaction, even a disaster at a nuclear power plant, strontium-90 would be released. It's pretty dangerous if it gets into your body. It's a little less dangerous if it's in your skin, but once it gets into your system, it's pretty nasty. It's a bone seeker, meaning that the radioactive isotopes goes through calcium receptors in your bones. Exposure to strontium-90, say through milk, or even if it's just in water, or if it's in food that you eat, it can really cause serious problems like bone cancer, digestive system breakdowns, kidney failure, a bunch of really nasty stuff. And it was a really huge campaign point in the political race, the presidential race between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater in 1964. A lot of people tend to know about the Daisy ad, right? The one, right? You want to describe the Daisy ad?
It's the most famous political ad ever made, probably still. And they tell me it only ran once. It was against Goldwater, and it's the little girl picking daisies and just singing a happy little song, and then this countdown starts, and then, well, the implication is, oops, we dropped a mushroom cloud right on this adorable tyke's head.
4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9.
Yep, and don't vote for Barry Goldwater because he's gonna be causing this to happen because was a bit of a firebrand. He talked about preemptively launching an attack against the Soviets because it's gonna happen anyways. We might as well do it first. And Lyndon Johnson was no peacenik.
I was gonna say, it's
right?
like, well, so we got peacenik LBJ, kumbaya.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
What he had done at least was work with, with Kennedy previously and others to do a limited test ban treaty, meaning that we would no longer test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. We decided we're going to stick those things underground, test them underground, no longer test them underwater or in an atmosphere. And because strontium-90 was getting to a lot of in the air, and it was going to a lot of people and making them sick in the immediate area, but really anywhere in the United States. If you have a bottle of wine that's supposed to be from before 1945 and you want to test whether or not the bottle is actually that old, one of the ways you can test it is you can bring it to someone who can do an isotope scan and can see whether or not there's cesium.
Whoa, really?
And you can see if it doesn't have cesium, which is a byproduct of a nuclear detonation, then you know it was bottled before we started testing nuclear weapons.
Wow.
Because that's how the stuff just kind of gets everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like chemistry or any sort of chemical stuff. It's all a matter of degree, how much of this stuff is going to be in your system. But we've all got cesium in us because of how much we've been doing these nuclear tests. Strontium-90 got into one of these campaign ads, the same type of ads that the Daisy ad was. This ad was called Ice Cream, and it's just a child licking an ice cream cone. I think it's vanilla ice cream, while the narrator is talking about the dangers of Barry Goldwater wanting to do more nuclear testing in the atmosphere.
Do you know what people used to do? They used to explode atomic bombs in the air. Now, children should have lots of vitamin A and calcium, but they shouldn't have any strontium-90 or cesium-137. These things come from atomic bombs, and they're radioactive. They can make you die. Do you know what people finally did? They got together and signed a nuclear test ban treaty, and then the radioactive poison started to go away. But now, there's a man who wants to be president of the United States, and he doesn't like this treaty. He wants to go on testing more bombs. His name is Barry Goldwater.
Pretty scary stuff. We covered, which feels like 10 years ago, but 4 years ago, right before the 2016 presidential election, we covered the Daisy ad on our podcast. So people want to go back and check that out. We talk about ice cream. We talk about daisies. How about in the movie, the family talks a little bit about radiation concerns. Scotty doesn't know what it is, but he asks, like, what is it? And no one answers him. The kind of ironic thing is that Mary Liz hands him a banana and says, here, eat this instead of asking questions about radiation. And it's ironic because bananas are actually, because of the potassium, they're naturally radioactive. You can hide low levels of radioactive material in a box if you cover it with bananas because it produces a false alarm with a radiation detector. It's all fine. Bananas are perfectly fine. I love bananas, but they are naturally radioactive. They're undergoing spontaneous nuclear fission.
Weird.
But it's a lot of depressing stuff. Let's get back to less depressing things, like how Larry, one of the neighborhood kids, decides to come live with them, and their family takes him in because Larry's family, both of his parents, were in San Francisco, and we don't know what's going on. But it is nice that the mom is not only trying to take care of her 3 kids, but she's also starting to take in other kids from the neighborhood. It is nice to see some of that. But when you mentioned earlier wanting to see people starting to panic, not really wanting to see them, but you would normally expect that in a movie. Why don't you describe what happens at the church when the town kind of gets together for a meeting?
When I'm watching this, I think it's going to be like the show Jericho or things like that, where nobody ever really just flips out. But I always forget that this movie has this really good pacing where you have an ebb and flow of terror and panic.
Mm-hmm.
And the town meeting, like, there's all this talk about how they're going to keep things together and they're not going to loot stuff. I guess the guy with the pharmacy says there had been looting a little bit. Like, we don't see that. There's the one guy who starts describing some of these symptoms of radiation sickness. Here's what we all have to look forward to, folks.
The town doctor, yeah. He mentions dizziness, gastroenteritis, fever, vomiting, skin sores, hair loss. Some pretty nasty stuff. And then what else? There's they talked about school being canceled. I think they still kept up going to school for at least a little while. The teacher says they want to keep everybody keeping on. There's no food at the supermarket, but now the police are there. The police says that they're going to open up communication soon and keep looting to a minimum. Kevin Costner says that people probably aren't going to come and help them, so let's organize some sort of civil defense. But then the mother says something really sad, the mother of the newborn. She says that the baby wouldn't take the breast milk this morning. They started to throw up the breast milk.
And she asks the doctor if that, like, it might be normal, right? And, like, there's not anything I can do about that. And he just straight up does not answer.
Yeah, the doctor does not, it's not super helpful. People argue whether or not they can even organize civil defense, or is canned food safe. Everyone's arguing over what's going on. And there's a lot of panic. Gas is running out. There's long lines. Hiroshi's dad, Mike, is out there with a rifle, trying to manage the long queue of people. He's giving away gas to his regular customers.
Mike telling Carol they get free gas because, not just because they live in the town and, like, someone nearby maybe doesn't, it's because he particularly knows them and they've been kind to him and to his kid, who I think has Down syndrome. And obviously the little kid actor has that as well.
It's the same thing in the short story. Is the son, I think the son's name in the short story is Teddy and not Hiroshi, but it's the same situation. I think, yeah, he's mentally challenged, and talks about how that Mike says this nice thing because Carol says, we'll take your gas because we appreciate it, but you need to come over and we'll repay you with dinner. And Mike says, you've already paid this thousands of times previously, being nice to me and to Hiroshi. So you're right. You do get the sense that there's people relying in times of crisis on their community relationships that they may have formed.
Civil defense.
Yeah. I like it. The best civil defense is a good kindness offense. So yeah, we see a few scenes of, like, grocery stores, people lining up for food. You see the civil defense logo, which is a triangle with a C and a D in the middle of it, kind of around there. So it looks like it's a little bit organized, except it takes 4 hours to get any sort of food. People are bickering about line cutting and all this kind of stuff. But you see the police there under gun, making sure everything is in order. We get this little quick scene where people are donating extra batteries for, I guess, radios or just in general, because there are probably not going to be any new battery shipments. Duracell's not dropping off any more supplies these days. But then we get this scene where I really like it. It's Brad, one more last second, playing with one of his little electronic games. I think it's like a spelling game. Him trying to play with it before he gives the batteries away. But then the same thing's happening. We get the town bully, this kid named Bill Docker. He steals some batteries. Kind of a jerk. So he's someone who's not being nice and in civil.
They absolutely cast an actor who would be the bully in any 80s movie you've ever seen, which I find slightly irritating, but also hilarious.
He looks like one of the bullies from Power Rangers. I don't know if you watched Power Rangers in the 90s.
Oh, it's been a long time.
Yeah, he looks like Bulk and Skull from the Power Rangers TV show. The one thing I like about this movie is it's not like there are big, sweeping, epic scenes of conflict and battle. It's just very low-key throughout the entirety of the movie. Even when awful things happen, which is about to start happening, really bad, it's always just it's just mundane because of how much of the suffering is going on, and nothing really peaks too high or too low. It's just kind of awful all around. But you do get these little moments. Brad finally makes his big bike trip. It looks like he's getting into better shape, the kind of stuff that his dad would always want him to do. He shows up to Mr. Abhart's home and volunteers to help out with the radio and to start relaying messages back and forth, checking in on people. This is one of my favorite parts of the short story, is how Carol and the family decide to start visiting people that are sick. Kind of stuff you would do these days in during coronavirus. You know, checking in on neighbors. You don't have to go in their house, but maybe you just kind of knock on the door, maybe drop off some food. We have a neighbor in our community who's very, very old, and she doesn't have a lot of family on this particular side of the country, so some of the other neighbors always are constantly checking in, kind of to the point where the neighbor is complaining about the number of times people knock on her door. But it's nice to kind of see that in a community. At the same time, we're also getting reports from Mr. Abhart and his radio that there's blast damage in Santa Rosa, California, a place right now in our real life that's being hit pretty hard by the fires that were happening in California. So things are not sounding great. No one's coming to help, basically, it sounds like. 11 days later, Carol's watching some old movies on her TV. Looks like some old stuff like out of a VHS tape or something. She talks about wearing her husband's sweater to get the smell. I think she's pretty, at this point, convinced he's not coming back. And this, I think, is one of the saddest scenes in the story. The mom decides, let's perk everybody up. Let's go for a picnic. Let's take what food we do have in our very bare pantry, and let's go for a picnic. Let's go to the place where we planted a bunch of trees when all of the kids were born. Then let's go look at the trees. Let's see how big the trees are. And when they get there, the tree is dead. Radiation and blast or whatever bad things are happening have killed the tree. That's very foreshadowing. She mentions particularly Scotty's tree is dying. We do also get reports that people are leaving town. The doctor has left town immediately, which is kind of a jerk move, right? But the doctor's gone, and there's a bunch of people that are starting to leave. But if you happen to do stay in town, you get to watch the school play, the Pied Piper story. Some of the kids, they say, can't make it because they're sick, but the play goes on. You want to talk about the play a little bit? I'm familiar in general with the Pied Piper story. Did you know a lot about it beforehand? This is a really huge black hole for me in terms of pop culture or these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I wasn't super up on it, but I know it's been used in sort of in the context of other stories. In the so in the Anne of Green Gables series, in the final book, like Anne of Green Gables is older, and her kids, like World War I happens, and her one kid ends up, like, he goes to World War I, even though he was kind of a pacifist. It's kind of a weirdly pro-war book. It's a bummer. But he writes a poem that you don't actually see, but that it sort of like becomes a thing in this world. It's called The Pied Piper. And it's supposed to have been about how, like, the Pied Piper's calling, and, like, that's why we're all going to war. And you don't get a great sense of, like, what the content would have been, but and that book is from, decades before this movie. So just like, I know the Pied Piper is used. I did already have sort of a more meta association with it than it ever being, the original story that it is. And the way it's used in Testament, it almost could be heavy-handed, but it's it's pretty damn smoothly integrated. The panning over the little kids and stuff could be just like punching you in the face, but I don't know. They make it work in a way.
I guess the story is that there's a town called Hamlin. It's overrun with rats during some kind of plague, and the mayor hires the Pied Piper, and I think Pied means someone that's like wearing an outfit of many different colors. but he's a piper because he's got a magic flute. He's paid, basically. Hey, here's a contract. You get rid of the rats, we pay you this certain amount of gold or some sort of valuable object. And the Pied Piper goes and does all this stuff, but the mayor and the town folk, they refuse to pay. And the Pied Piper gets upset, changes his tune on his flute, and instead of just getting mad, he gets even and sings that song to lure all of the children away from the town. In different versions of the story, either the children are kind of led away to a mountain to live out their lives away from their family, or they're led into the same river where all of the rats drowned. It's some pretty awful stuff. But I guess the key thing from the play in the movie is that the mayor says, "Oh, my son, he's gone, he's dead. Oh, what have we done?" And the Pied Piper says, "Your children are not dead. They will return. They are just waiting until the world deserves them."
Boy, is that just summing it all up, isn't it?
Pretty much.
The politician. The politician, like, makes a deal, and the deal breaks down, and it is because of his selfishness, and then all the children are gone because of his selfishness.
And not just all the children, his. So now it's finally affecting him, right? Speaking of children, we see our friend Kevin Costner. He's kind of mindlessly walking down the street, holding a cabinet drawer, like an old wooden cabinet, and one of the drawers from it, really walking down the street like a zombie. And Carol runs into and asks, "Oh, what's the shelf for?" You kind of learned eventually it's a casket, and it's a casket for their baby, the one that previously was sick and throwing up milk. It's passed away from probably radiation sickness. Kevin Costner mentions that they've been told to conserve wood, and because they couldn't find a box that was big enough or small enough, this worked out pretty well. This is one of the sadder scenes in the movie, I think. Kevin Costner says, we thought we were the lucky ones because the bombs didn't really fall on us. We thought there would be no more bombs, and there haven't been. The war seems to be over, at least from Hamlin's perspective in terms of the active conflict, but, their baby got sick, and it died. Kathy, the mother, the baby, she's pretty depressed. She blames herself a lot for breastfeeding the baby, though it might have been contaminated. They talk about boiling the water that they would have used for formula and other things to keep the baby safe, but they may not have known this. Boiling water doesn't do anything with radioactive fallout. It's not like a bacteria. You have to filter out the radioactive particles, so they weren't getting good information. Ultimately, we find out that Kevin Costner and the wife, they leave town. They get in a car and drive away. The family, Carol and Brad and Mary Liz and Scotty, they decide to stay. Still waiting for Tom, I guess. Or just, in general, this is their home. They're not going to leave. Pretty sad. Any thoughts more on that?
He does, again, you're like, oh, that's why you became a big actor, because you did such a... Yeah, the whole scene, and just, I don't know, it's really good. I hate it, and it's really good with the drawer and everything. With the boiling water, though, again, I keep thinking why you don't get a scene of them just looking up what exactly they should be doing in this, after this event when things could be contaminated. You had the doctor near the beginning talk about radiation sickness. You had Brad talk about radiation getting into milk, but at the town meeting, you don't see sort of any directive. I almost want a scene like in the show Jericho, which clearly was influenced a little bit by this, and probably the novel Alas, Babylon. They're both about being sort of the perfect, in a sense, distance from nuclear strikes where, you're safe, but there's obviously repercussions from this happening. And there's a scene in the episode where they all have to hide from the fallout, where they're looking in the library, and all they see are 1950s civil defense manuals, horribly out of date. Mm-hmm. And there's one, that says, "Our friend the atom," and the one character says, "Some friend," this.
Well, that's a reference to that's a Disney cartoon.
Yeah.
Our friend the atom. It's tough. It's really tough to get good information in the middle of these things. One of the scenes I do like in The Day After is after the bomb is dropped and the war is over, you get a bunch of farmers, because it takes place in Kansas, and they're all sitting around and they're getting guidance. Sometimes it's pamphlets, other times they might have had someone that was like a local CD volunteer, civil defense volunteer, and they're reading off all of the guidance, and they say, you need to remove the top 6 inches, I think it's 6 inches of topsoil, and replace it, and you need to take that 6 inches of topsoil, it's contaminated, you want to throw it away and put it somewhere, and they give all this guidance away, and the farmers are like, but that would, you can't plant anything anymore. Or how are we supposed to do this? We don't have our farm equipment isn't working. There's no fuel. There's nothing's working. Or they start basically giving really practical responses to that. And the people who are reading the guidance are like, I don't know. I don't know what to do. It doesn't say. We'll circle back. We'll get back to you on this.
You know what? They actually talk about the 6 inches of topsoil in kind of in the same scene in Jericho, which is set in Kansas as well, but it has way too many mountains in the background for it not to be California.
You told me to watch Jericho, and I said I was going to many years ago when we did our Fallout episode. I'm still working on it. I watched the first episode. I need to get into it again. When I get Netflix again, I'll start. I promise. Carol mentions in the movie she wonders whether or not maybe the baby was the lucky one for dying so quickly. Very depressing scene there. The kids are fighting. Mary Liz was feeding a stray cat. The brother didn't like that. Mary Liz was, because they don't have a lot of food. Mary Liz says, but we're feeding Larry. He's kind of like a stray cat. And they all just are not particularly doing very well. Scotty goes missing. He tries to run away, but before he runs away, he goes to the cemetery and starts like burying some of his toys.
Yeah.
Scotty's like, we don't have any food to feed them anymore, so I guess I'm gonna bury them. So, very sad. Carol, the mother, tries to comfort Scotty, says that it's okay to be scared. There's so many funerals happening in the background while all of this is happening. Some of the funerals have a lot of people there to mourn. Other ones are really only visited by the people digging the graves themselves. Back at Mr. Abhart's house with the radio, they're talking about how there's no more messages. No one's answering anymore. Santa Rosa is not answering anymore. He's starting to get a lot more radio silence. There's no more garbage pickups. Food is running low. They're not burying people anymore. They're setting them on fire. Either they're out of room or it's taking too much energy for people to actually have to dig all of the graves. There's a scene with the police chief basically having like a nervous breakdown, he says he can't keep order anymore.
That was another one of those scenes that Scotty digging the holes, I also sort of paid more attention to the second time around and found more disturbing for obvious reasons. I also noticed the police chief, like that actor does a really good job where it's this subtle, just like, this is all too much. And of all the people to be having a nervous breakdown, it's the police chief. I mean, fair enough, dude, but it's also so unsettling.
Particularly in a small community like that, when you probably know your police chief. I don't know who my police chief is. And he's still wearing his uniform, but it's clearly ragged. It's torn. It's dirty. Things are pretty rough. There's a nice little tender moment of Carol and Mary Liz at home. They're looking over old photographs. Mary Liz asks what it's going to be like. What would it be like to have a relationship? What would it be like to make love? What would it be like to do all of these things that she wants to do, but she's not confident she's going to get to have that kind of a life. It's a nice little moment.
The teenage actress doesn't have a ton to do in the movie, but that is her moment. Honestly, before that, I wasn't sure, like, she wasn't terrible, but, all she kind of had to do was miss her dad, be kind of like daddy's princess a little bit at the beginning of the movie, and then be upset when he never came back. But that moment, she is really good, and it's barely even a maybe that she won't get to have that. Yeah. Her final scene is she's saying, like, not for me, basically. Like, I'm never going to know about that. It's terrible.
I really like the fact that the kids are at 3 different ages. So Scotty is dealing with things pretty much in the abstract. I don't have food to feed my toys, so I'm going to bury them. What is radiation? I don't even know. Can I have a banana? That level of ignorance, but still that's how he associates with the stuff. And then you've got Mary Liz at the higher end. She knows what's going on. She knows that she's not going to have a childhood, and she may not even get to have a relationship in an adulthood, for whatever the reason is. And then you've got Brad somewhere kind of in the middle, trying to do what his dad would do, trying to keep things up, trying to be helpful, but also what his mom would do. Following his mom's example of helping people, and him trying to maybe put aside toys. He literally is that point where he has toys, then he puts it away so that he could donate the batteries to someone else, maybe a younger child or to someone else, and he tries to kind of be that bridge between his different generations. I think I really like the way that they did that. The 3 kids with 3 different ages is particularly good.
Yeah, actually, this time around I paid sort of more attention to Brad, and he's sort of not quite a gee whiz, like, sort of earnest character, but it's a believable version of that. Yeah. And I'm, a lot of the time I'm like, oh, son, take care of your mother. Like, you're 10 and she's 40, but you're the man of the house now. Like, when those things are made explicit in movies, I often roll my eyes, but it's done in this lovely, like, sad way where he's just like a good kid. And you had this sort of overbearing dad at the beginning being like, be better at bike riding, son. And Brad's riding the bike all over the movie, getting stronger. And he becomes the adult that his dad was sort of haranguing him to be. But obviously he shouldn't have to be that adult. It wasn't supposed to go that way.
Not for many years.
Brad's bike gets stolen by that, like, the town 80s bully.
He comes in, steals food, and steals the bike. It's awful.
But then Brad has to get his dad's bike out, which, again, symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's well done. It's not like, but like, you know what it, you kind of get what it means without it being anything but subtle, you know?
I didn't pick that up until the third time I watched this movie. I thought that was a really good scene.
Yeah.
So that's very good stuff. What's not is Scotty. Scotty's sick. His mother tries to give him this. I actually stopped really when I watched this the last time because I've been starting to give my son a bath in a bathtub, and it's very sad. I had to take a second here because the mother's just trying to give him a bath, but he's bleeding. Right? He's got diarrhea. He's got a fever. She tries to hold him in a sheet to kind of make him go to sleep. And then the next morning, the mother's scrambling to find something. You don't really know what it is. She's like in Scotty's room, looking under the bed, looking everywhere. She's trying to find his teddy bear because Scotty has died and the priest is here now to bury him in their backyard. And she wants him to be buried with the teddy bear, but she just cannot find it anywhere. The priest just, like Kevin Costner earlier, just kind of zombie walks into the backyard, just starts saying prayers as soon as he's still walking. The mother's like, no, you can't do this yet. Very sad. And you get to the point where you think that priest has just done 15 funerals that day. The mom, she's very sad, puts batteries that I think takes batteries out of a flashlight and puts it in the answering machine box so she can hear the husband's voice again about him being late for dinner. The whole thing, people are just barely on hanging by a thread.
I thought that the mom, I could be wrong, I thought that she was looking for batteries for the flashlight and she listens to the message one more time.
Oh, maybe that's what it was.
And then she takes them out and puts them in the flashlight.
Narratively, that works better.
Yeah, I mean, one last moment of listening to his voice, and then back to sort of the practical survival things.
Oh, that makes more sense. I like that. Thanks for pointing that out. That works really well. Brad goes back to Mr. Abhart. Mr. Abhart's suffering from memory loss and his voice. He's losing his voice. I think it's implied that his wife has just passed away. He still pledges to man the radio, but no one's answering anymore. I think it's implied pretty soon after that Mr. Abhart is dead. Brad still tries to help people. He's on his dad's bike. He's cycling through town. He's trying to help people out. You see that the cemetery's full. There's just trash everywhere. People are burning bodies. Kind of out of nowhere, we see the mom making something out of bed sheets and thread and needle. And it turns out it's a funeral shroud for Mary Liz because she got sick. There's not even a scene where she's sick. She just, the next scene, you see her holding her daughter on a bed trying to bury her, make a little shroud for her. The fact that you get all this kind of build-up, a little bit of a build-up for Scotty and then nothing for Mary Liz, I think is a really powerful turn for this, about how rote everything is getting. The suffering being just as normal as breathing, really.
Yeah, it's really, really good pacing. You know, the director, I assume, screenwriter, whoever decided to do that. You have sort of the actual normalcy, the attack, the attempted normalcy. The way I always watch it, it starts to get the misery starts to sort of increase more and more. And once you get to the Scotty scene, which is maybe the most unsettling scene in the whole movie, there's like this downward slope, towards doom. It's not like it's not a big deal anymore, but
you can get to normalcy. It just really sucks when your normalcy is awful because you get used to it and everything is relative, and normalcy is things aren't on fire. Internally and also within your family and your community, things are falling apart, but things are just, that's the normal.
Yeah. The community's collapsing, the family's crumbling sort of at the same time. There's never really any talk that anything can be fixed. Like, there's no, maybe the army will arrive, or even if they did, what could they do for them? It's this strange mixture of keeping on, but never expecting to be saved in this movie.
Yeah, because it's like keep calm and carry on, but towards what end? You don't really know when you can stop.
Yeah.
I think one of the themes about this movie is that really what you can do is what you can do. It's you do whatever you can for as long as you can. And sometimes that means bringing in Larry, your neighbor, who at some point Larry dies. And he dies of radiation sickness, and it's a very sad, additional loss. But you do what you can, and to the point where Brad, he rides past the gas station where Mike and Hiroshi would normally be, but Mike is dead. He probably has been dead for a little bit of time. Brad sees someone loading Mike into the back of a car, and no one answers him when he says, "Is that Mike?" But it's clear that's who that is, because he finds Hiroshi sitting in the garage with his fishing pole and just a bunch of canned food. Mike was dying and he says, all right, Hiroshi, this is you, man. Sorry, I can't help you anymore. A lot of the things I like about this movie are the scenes that don't get shown, but you knew happen. And this is one of those that I think is particularly strong. It's almost a little bit like the Fallout video game series, where you get the end of something that's happened a long time ago, but you just kind of see the remnants of it. You see a teddy bear set up at a fake little like tea party, and you don't know, you don't see the scene of someone setting that up, but you learn later on through context clues kind of what might have happened. You see two people that are skeletons embracing in a bathtub, and you know, like, that was something that happened, and you can kind of build your own story around it. I think this movie is particularly good at that stuff.
Absolutely, though. We saw enough of Mike that we did kind of like Mike from what we saw.
Well, one of the things I like about this, Brad doesn't go home and ask Mom for permission to take Hiroshi home. He just does. He just does what he needs to do now. So he grabs Hiroshi with some canned food and the fishing pole, puts him on his bike, and they bike home, and the mom's like, okay, Hiroshi now lives with us.
It's one of the last sort of sweet scenes, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
because the next scene you get is Carol in the pantry and there's rats eating all of their food. Things are tough. No one's answering the radio anymore. Brad takes over that job. There's a scene where he says, "This is Hamlin looking for a call," and no one's answering anymore. Mom is sick. She's throwing up in the toilet. Everything is just kind of getting really bad. You see this one last scene, one of the only scenes in the movie where someone has a huge emotional outpour. And it's Carol at night at a funeral pyre watching people in the town being burned. And she falls to her knees and digs in the dirt and starts screaming, "Who did this?" Not really at anyone in particular. The movie screws with us because someone walks up from behind, a man, and grabs her and kisses her. And you think, oh, that's the dad. That's the first time I thought I saw that movie. I was like, oh, that's Dad. He's back. And no, it's the priest. They have a little moment of a kiss, and then once they realize what's going on, nothing else happens. It's they just basically have a little bit of a moment of human connection. It's that scene. I still think about that scene all the time. I don't know what it's trying to say other than just, oh, it's not the dad. There's a little bit of a moment of connection. Now they're both just kind of crying and supporting each other, but it's a lot of chaos.
I don't think the first time I noticed it was the priest.
I had to look it up later because he looks disheveled. He's not wearing his priestly garb anymore.
Yeah,
but it is
and I
the
saw
priest.
your notes, and then when I watched, I paid attention, and I still was like, of all the people for it being the priest is really interesting. There's probably a million pages of like overthinking that I don't know.
Well, that's what I do. That's my job here.
Yet it reminds me of yet another end of the world type movie that I've seen. Last Night, where the world's going to end at like midnight for some unspecified cause. Sandra Oh is the main character, and she meets some dude, and she wants him to help her commit suicide, like right as the world ends. And spoiler alert, universe, they end up kissing each other just as the world ends, instead of shooting each other. Which sounds sort of melodramatic, and it sort of is, but it's really well done. I thought of that when I was watching last night and thinking, like, it's not about that it's the priest of all people and our protagonist. It's somebody.
Right.
It's another human. It's connection near the end. It doesn't mean romance or like sexual attraction. I'm not totally sure. It's a very interesting choice to include.
It's a question I have every time I watch this movie, trying to figure out what's going on there. But it is just, it's something, she's not well. She goes back to the house. She basically preps the house to look like they're leaving, because there's been discussion about people leaving, and Carol said previously that they weren't going to leave. But now it's just her, it's Brad, and it's Hiroshi. Put sheets all over all of the furniture in the house. She looks at the piano that Mary Liz used to play, and it looks like she's about to like maybe play a note, but she doesn't. She can't do it, and she closes the lid of the piano keys, and they go in the car. So it's Hiroshi and Brad and Carol, and they're in the car, and you realize the door to the garage is closed. They go to start the car, and you realize, oh no, this is because Carol's going to kill them. And they all seem to know it. At least maybe Hiroshi doesn't know it, but Brad, it's pretty clear Brad also knows what's happening. They're going to commit suicide with carbon monoxide poisoning. Even to the point where Brad's like, all right, come on, let's do it. Because they know this is kind of it. But Carol can't do it. Even in the short story, she can't turn the key. She's not able to do that. the last scene you really see in the movie is they are celebrating, I'm not sure whose birthday, maybe it's the dad's or maybe it's Brad's. Did you ever see who it is? But they're celebrating someone's birthday.
Well, you see, yeah, I think it might be Brad solely because there was the talk about his birthday at the start of the movie.
Oh, that's a good point. A couple months later, yeah.
Pretty sure at the start of the movie they talked about it being in 2 months. So if only 2 months have passed, that's
oh geez,
somehow more disturbing.
That makes the writing even better that it is Brad's birthday, because she was talking about in that scene what they were going to get him, and she says, well, he wants this new computer game, and the dad's like, no, he needs to get a new bicycle, a good bicycle. The mom mentions at some point, all right, so we've got these graham crackers and a little bit of peanut butter, we've got our candles, and we're going to sing happy birthday, but we need a present. And Hiroshi hands over the teddy bear of Scotty's that she was looking for earlier, and she wasn't able to find it. And it's really nice, and they make a wish to blow out the candles. Brad asks what they should wish for, and Carol has this little moment where she says,
what do we do now? Make a wish. What do we wish for, Mom? That we remember it all. The good and the awful. The way we finally lived. That we never gave up. That we will last to be here. To deserve the children.
Movie ends with a little bit of stock family footage of them celebrating one of the dad's previous birthdays. Very, very happy in that particular scene, but that's kind of how the movie ends. Pretty powerful gut punch right at the end, huh?
Just like, I already watched it yesterday, but going through it again, I'm like, oh God. Just...
We don't know what happens, and that's one of the things I wanted to get into now that we're going to transition to our super critical nuclear podcast, nuke plot discussion stuff. The first point I wanted to raise is I really like this movie. I love how this movie makes it really hard to analyze in the very usual way that we do. You know, is this scene as accurate in terms of what's reality? What is this telling people about nuclear war? And, you know, is all these things that tended to make me want to do this podcast, the kinds of things that I got triggered for previously. You know, this movie doesn't have a lot of those. One of the reasons why it doesn't have a lot of those is because it decides that it's not going to be that kind of a story. You know, we never learn who started the war, if it's over, why it happened. We never see bomb detonation visuals beyond the bright light. You know, no mushroom clouds, fireball, windows breaking, no blast, anything like that. No one of government authority really outside the town. We never really learn what happened to the dad. Never hear what actually happens. We have no definitive idea what will happen to Carol, to Brad, to Hiroshi. Probably won't end well, but maybe it does. We just don't know. It really is great because it just focuses so much on this is how this town is experiencing nuclear war. Someone could tell you in a nuclear conflict, there's going to be 15 mega deaths that will occur. You know, 15 million people would die within the X amount of time. How do you associate that to anything you really know? Like in the United States, we talk about 200,000 people dying currently due to the coronavirus, and that's just a hard statistic for anyone to really, you know, grapple with. But if you say, oh, that's the population of this city, just gone. Mm-hmm. Or if you say, you know, in this way, it's like, here's how this one town would experience this. It makes it so much more powerful that the people who are just trying to kind of lead their lives, they're innocent, they're just, as you mentioned at the beginning, these are the kind of squabbles that you want them to live a Hallmark movie, and they deserve these kinds of conflicts, but not having to make, you know, burial shrouds for their kids or worry about what kind of radioactive milk. It makes it hard to nitpick, but I think it's great because the thing that really matters in this movie is people reacting to these things. There's a really strong sense of survivor's guilt in this movie, like people that you survive, your other loved ones don't. Are you even the lucky ones? Why are you the lucky ones? What does it mean to be the lucky one when you know you may be sick later in a kind of a more worse way? Is the dad the lucky one? The fact that he was in the city? These are the kind of questions that you tend to grapple with, and I think the movie is effective because it only lets you focus on those things rather than the simulacra of the explosion or any of those kinds of stuff that tend to be the things a lot of these kind of nuke movies focus. What do you think about all of that? Like, do you think there are things in the movie that you kind of wish you saw, or do you think that was as effective as I'm thinking it is?
I'd say it basically works. Sometimes, like, yet another comparison, there's this YA book I read called How We Live Now. It involves nukes and an army invasion. There's like a whole thing, but you never actually find out what happened, because I swear to God, the narrator, every time she's like, and then an adult tried to talk about what happened, but I wasn't paying attention. I'm like, God Just tell me what happened. I've seen and read other fiction where you assume it was the Soviet Union, right? I mean, that's whoever started the conflict. The logical guess, 1983, is that the Soviet Union was the one bombing, and perhaps the U.S. has done the same to them.
They mention in the movie massive retaliation is something that they mention, which kind of implies that the United States started this and the Soviets are retaliating. Maybe that's the only limited thing that I can kind of take away from this.
You don't need to know. You sort of assume something else totally weird could have happened. It just doesn't feel as contrived as it sometimes does that you don't know. Even like Jericho sort of dangles like excruciatingly slowly what happened. But there's something about the way this movie is done, where the way it's presented, that I don't want to yell at the characters for not wanting to find out.
Yeah.
When Carol yells, "Who did this?" It's not like, explain to me the policy decisions that led to this. It's almost, how could someone do this? This didn't, why? And it's all these other questions along with who did this. Just what a ridiculous waste this was.
And she puts a lot of it on herself. And if we take her last line in the movie, that we hope that we will last here and be here long enough to deserve the children. To kind of be good people, to be the people in a new world, if there is going to be one, that is deserving of children, deserving of however you want to describe. There's a lot of loaded stuff in that particular phrase, but deserving of a future, a brighter future. She puts herself probably into that a little bit. Maybe some people do that. Some stories focus on that. Miracle Mile covers that a bit at the end. Like, did we as innocent bystanders do enough to be pushing our governments to not have these kinds of weapons out there, to not have these kind of nuclear postures, to not be okay, just generally comfortable with the idea that the reason why we have peace since end of World War II at the global scale is because we have these things hanging over our heads. Like, that's fine. We're fine with that. She didn't push the button. And it's not like it's an excuse, like a justification. Your kids are dead because you didn't try harder, you didn't march in enough protests. None of those things are true, but those are the kind of questions that people will have. And it's the kind of stuff why it's so hard for people that are in favor of removing nuclear weapons from the world. It's a really still difficult message these days because people are focused on a lot of other stuff. Yeah, there's a lot baked into that everyone's trying to kind of really grapple with right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like tangential, like political, philosophical musings that you could take out of that. I mean, Carol's a generally good person. She's frazzled, slightly resentful at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
But she takes in poor Larry, who might not have a single line in the movie. Brad brings home Hiroshi, and he just becomes integrated into the remaining family. She is a good, decent person, and it's not her fault, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, the least amount of fault lies with kids, who the son was 5 years old. He cares about his toys getting enough to eat. I think that, saying we're all to blame, as if we're all equally to blame, us adults, age of majority, over 21 types. But at the same token, there's truth to it, that the kids are the most innocent ones. I said earlier that this movie really bothered my mom, and I don't have any kids. I sure bet that this movie becomes even more horrifying when you do, which...
Yep. I've seen this movie 3 times. I saw it way before I ever had a kid. I saw it while my wife was pregnant, and then I've seen it now since the children's been born. And it's a different experience every single time.
Yeah.
And I don't get that experience when I watch like G.I. Joe 2 and all the new scenes in that.
Wow, this is richer, more poignant content now.
Yeah. Well, so the normal things I would nitpick, right, or like the detonation scenes. There really isn't one. There is the scene where they're getting the news broadcast, which I think is pretty good. That is probably roughly how it would be, or it'd be some sort of an emergency broadcast message. But it's that same kind of frantic, like, all right, stay at home, lay down, that kind of stuff. And they do that. You do get a flash of really bright light. It's hard to tell how far away is it. San Francisco has lots of mountains kind of around the bay that could be blocking some of this light. Was this an airburst really high up in the air, which are the kinds of things you would do against a city? Yeah, you might be able to get a flash like that. It's kind of hard to nitpick any of these things because you don't really know. It's a fictional town. But I think the fact that there isn't anything else, like there's no blast wave, nothing's catching on fire, all that kind of stuff, that's all normal to me. I think you could see a flash like this and then not experience any of the other things you tend to be used to. I think it's weirder that it's like during the day and you get that kind of a flash, like with the whole house basically lights up. That makes me think that they were like line of sight of the city, and I don't think they actually are. But there's a lot of things there that it's a $750,000 movie. They filmed this I think in like Southern California somewhere. It's not going to fit exactly the neighborhood. But those are really the only things. The way that radiation sickness works in this movie, I think, is pretty close to actually how it would be. I think particularly in places that aren't immediately within the blast area. And it's not like it's several months later. We're talking, as you mentioned, like 2 months is really what's happening. Only other thing that I think some people that have asked me on Twitter about this movie is, if there's fallout, why is there not like fog or like cloud or dust everywhere? And
nuclear winter, straight up.
That really depends on how much radiation people get and how much smoke and debris. I think there should be something. I think a lot of that's mostly the budget for the movie, but I think it's enough that people are getting sick, and they also aren't cleaning. They're not disinfecting their clothes. They're just living their lives anywhere where there's this kind of radiation stuff happening. And it's a lot like coronavirus in the sense that it's an invisible killer. You don't see radiation. And they mention this a couple times in the day after, in the scene where Gutenberg is in the shelter and they go outside and they see all of the dead goats and sheep and stuff. You don't see it, but it's there and it's happening. You have to wait it out.
Sheltering in your house doesn't come up at all.
And you don't want to just shelter on your first floor of your house. You want to shelter somewhere where you're not being... Think about radiation fallout like snow. Where would snow accumulate? And where it's accumulating, like maybe on your walls outside or on your tree or your floor outside, or maybe in your clothes when you were outside and you kind of bring it in. Any one of those little snowflakes is something that will emit radiation until it stops. And it can be stopped by air, a certain amount of distance of air, lead, 2 inches of lead will stop it, certain amount of dirt will stop it, certain amount of concrete will stop it. No matter where this stuff is accumulating, eventually you could get away from it by just distance, but people are just living their lives in their first floor of their house when they probably should be in the basement. But you know what? There aren't a lot of basements in California, so it's not like people have places they can just go to. I get it, and that's why I think that the radiation sickness as we see it is pretty realistic, because no one's cleaning up even the little bit that's there. So of course it's going to get worse.
The way that the family dies sort of one by one, does that sort of ring as accurate as it's going to be?
Yeah, it tracks.
Yeah?
Radiation affects everybody differently. The exposure rates, some of the kids might be exposed more than the mom because they're outside playing.
Right.
They're drinking a lot more food and milk than the mother may be because of different reasons. People that tend to be younger with weaker immune systems might be affected more by the cancer or the digestive breakdown stuff that could be happening. Older elderly people might be also affected a lot more. People who are very healthy can be exposed to higher amounts of radiation and then still be able to recover. It's one of those things that's not going to be, you apply the same amount of fallout to 10 people, you're going to get 10 different results do they get exposed to. And also what kind of radiation? Maybe some people are getting exposed to cesium, other people are getting exposed to strontium-90. There's all kinds of different stuff. Some people could be getting iodine, radiation, really bad versions of iodine, so they're getting thyroid cancers, which are a little bit longer pacing, nasty stuff, versus cesium, which will get you pretty quick.
Yeah. Do we assume, not to put an ending that doesn't exist on the movie, but, do we assume that Carol, Brad, and Hiroshi die? Is there any reason to think they don't?
Yeah, I think there could be a reason that they don't. Could be that maybe they leave. Maybe they finally decide to get out of that area and they go somewhere where they're not just constantly being hit by radiation. There's a chance that after a certain amount of time, some of the worst, nastiest pieces of radioactive material out there would go through their half-lives, meaning that they would decay to the point of the amount of fission is not as dangerous as it once was. For some particles, it's 2 weeks. For some other stuff, it's really thousands of years. It all depends on the level of exposure to that kind of stuff. So I think there's a world where Carol can be okay, where Carol can recover.
Never occurred to me that she would be okay, honestly.
I think it's so much in the open there. It's not like if you get it, you're automatically going to die. It is a sad thing. It really, you just don't know. And they don't have tools. They mentioned at one point, the doctor's like, we don't have anything to measure radiation. We don't have a Geiger counter. We don't have anything. I think there's a world where they can be okay, but that's all relative, right? Like, are they going to die from radiation sickness? Maybe not, but...
Cholera or something in the refugee Canadian camp, like...
Yeah, everyone talks about walking up towards Canada, which may not have been as hit as hard. There's a few references here and there in the short story and in the movie where Mr. Abhart's what thing was a strategic value, meaning like it was something of military or industrial value that the other side, the Russians, I suppose here, would have targeted. He says at one point that Yosemite was hit, and like,
God.
Why? So that must
Take
have
that,
been...
nature.
Yeah. Old Faithful is now gone. Why? And he mentions that must have been an accident. Yeah, it might have been. Might have been an errant missile. So those are all kinds of questions. So where is safe? Maybe Canada's better. Who knows, right? What information are they getting that says Canada's any better? That may have been fifth-hand information from 15 different ham radio guys, and it's one person in like their cabin in Saskatchewan. It's like, yeah, I'm fine now.
All right, let's all go to Bob's Saskatchewan cabin.
That's why I think the movie, the fact that the town is cut off, is so realistic for how all this would go. You know, water, power, sewer, all the utilities are off. No civil defense communication. There's plans for all this stuff, but sometimes you have a good plan and then you get punched in the face and your plan goes away.
It suddenly occurs to me, this is very strange. I mean, did they need civil defense manuals? Like, there's so much controversy and debate back in the day about civil defense. You know, oh, we're just terrifying children for no reason, you know, or the idea that to prepare for nuclear war in the way that they did back in the height of things was to imply that if it's survivable, it's considerable. Like, we could actually do this and survive. And people wanted, for very obvious reasons, to say, no, we're not doing this because we're just not. It's not. It just seems like they needed a little more information, and that if they had done like the protect and survive, like build a mattress fort and hidden it for 2 weeks, or like I'm remembering, I've never actually watched When the Wind Blows, but I read the comic.
Building your inner refuge.
Yeah, it's about this British couple. There's nuclear war, and the man is constantly like absurdly London Blitz, keep calm and carry on. And he keeps sort of repeating like all the manuals, what exactly you're supposed to do, in this sort of absurdly optimistic, like, well, if we just do just what they told us to do and we'll be fine, we're checking things off the list. It's kind of mocking of the civil defense things and the suggestions, I think, because it's just like, and they're not okay at the end is the implication. And it's this absurd, incredibly dark humor.
James and Hilda.
Yeah, I haven't even watched the movie because I'm like, oh god.
Yeah, be careful. That movie wrecks me every time I watch it.
Dude, The Snowman, which was by the same cartoonist, the movie of that was upsetting as a child. So that one will just Yeah. But I mean, I'm just overthinking now. If this little town had more of these sort of stereotypical civil defense stuff, would more people have been okay? I don't know. That's kind of taking the poetry out of things. I mean, I don't know.
People have those debates about civil defense. If you prepare for nuclear war, do you make it less likely or more likely? Are you a realist to say that it's going to probably happen? So people need to be prepared, even if the information's not perfect. Maybe there's at least something, because otherwise you end up with people boiling water thinking that it will solve radiation problems. Or is it one of those things where if you get a population thinking like, yeah, we could probably survive this, we've got more nukes, we'll go faster than they do, we're just generally stronger, we're going to have all this civil defense, we'll have fallout shelters, it'll be fine, then you don't go into the streets and start protesting your government saying, maybe let's get rid of the number of nuclear weapons that we do have. You know, those are all real debates, and it sounds like this town was just not particularly well prepared at all for any of this information, and nor were any of the families. But it's not, it's hard to like fault the families for this kind of stuff, because they're trying to live their own hectic lives. How much in my day do I spend, and this is sincere, how much of my day do I spend reading my nuclear manuals, my nuclear fallout manuals? I have a poster on my wall here in my basement that's about, can you protect yourself from fallout? Yeah, go to your local civil defense and get your pamphlet. And I have those pamphlets, but I don't spend a lot of time actually reading them, because sometimes the information's great, other times it's exaggerated in terms of its positive effect, other times it's absurd. Like, let's talk about the what I call the parking lot movie discussion, and this is a kind of a non-nuclear discussion here. Parking lot refers to when I was growing up, when we would go to the movies, movie theaters, that kind of stuff that I think are still around in buildings. We just don't really go to them all that much these days. But I used to sit around in the parking lot with friends, and we would discuss the movie before we would go our separate ways. There's this great quote here that I think you really liked from Roger Ebert. So he gave it the highest 4-star rating. Something that he brought up that makes me kind of rethink a little bit about the movie is this movie about hope or despair, or kind of where it is on that tipping point? What's ultimately the message of Testament? I'm going to read a little bit of the quote that he says, and then I want to get your reaction to this, because I'm glad that you wanted to kind of quote this here. Testament may be the first movie in a long time that will make you cry. It made me cry. and seeing it again for the second time, knowing everything that would happen, anticipating each scene before it came, I was affected just as deeply. But the second time, I was able to see more clearly that the movie is more than just a devastating experience, that it has a certain message of hope. It is the film of a suburban American family and what happens to that family after a nuclear war. It is not a science fiction movie, and it does not have any special effects. And I think there are no big scenes of buildings blowing over or people disintegrating. We never even see a mushroom cloud. We never even know who started the war. Instead, Testament is a tragedy about manners. It asks how we might act towards one another, how our values might stand up in the face of an overwhelming catastrophe. I think that's something that I needed to pick up again on the second viewing as well. After the gut punch of every scene after scene of awfulness kind of hit me. What do you think about this? What do you think ultimately the message of Testament is? You've seen a number of these films. How does this place in the apocalyptic catalog?
I wouldn't say it's about hope, even in a qualified way, the way that Ebert did.
Mm-hmm.
A tragedy about manners. I really like that, because I definitely get what he's saying there, where not manners like in sort of inane, sort of sit up straight and don't slurp, actually being kind to your neighbors, not immediately retreating into selfishness because this astronomically terrible thing has happened. And the ending, nobody would blame Carol for committing suicide at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Brad is aware. I mean, it's, well, okay, someone would, but like, we get it as viewers at least. And we don't, the cavalry didn't come in. There was no reason to not do it exactly, except to keep on and just keep being alive. Hope isn't the right word.
Yeah. There
certainly is a lot of despair. It's just very, very human, I guess. And not to say that those other movies are lacking a humanity, but their humanity tends to be punched in the face by nuclear doom. And this is just a little different. It could be about a different tragedy, I guess. And, it could be about a plague or something like that. But it is, to me, though, whenever it's a human done thing, completely human done, I'm always more sort of indignant on behalf of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And when I watched it the first time, I was thinking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, every country has done horrible things, but to know that the one that I get to pay taxes to did make parents watch their children die in the same way, well, that will never be okay with me.
Sure. And I think that's part of what Carol tries to say at the end when she says she hopes at some point we'll deserve the children. I think that's that kind of stuff that she kind of lumps herself into, that whole overall acquiescence and kind of slow walk towards the consequences and the actions that we see in the movie.
Yeah.
As bleak as the movie is, I do think it is kind of more hopeful in terms of the ending than the short story. The way the short story works is that she also tries to commit suicide, but in the car, but is unable to do so. There's no Pied Piper story, which we'll get into in a second here, but there is a last entry where she prays to God in her journal that Scotty and Teddy, who is Hiroshi in the movie, that they die before she does, so that they're not having to suffer as long as she may be willing to do her for herself. And she pleads that those that may be reading her journal years later would know how her family and the town held up. And here's what the quote is. Final entry. If survivors come here, want them to know something. We didn't act like animals. Most people were good, helped, tried. If only we could have lived as well as we have died. I wish. I kind of like that particular framing a little bit more than the Pied Piper story. I think the Pied Piper story complicates this movie a little bit more than it adds in terms of the metaphor. So it's an addition from the short story over it. I get it as a framing device a little bit. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm just dumb and I don't understand that particular darker element to the Pied Piper story. But to me, it was a lot of me trying to figure out what they were trying to say with this, more so than I think the impact that it ultimately had on me, at least when I watched it. Even the second time, it was the third time really where I'm like, oh, I see what they're aiming for here. It introduces the kids to the story, which I liked, and it has that little last bit of dialogue about civilization returning to become worthy again. I just don't know how effective it is. What about you? Do you think that is something that works for you? Or maybe I'm just not getting it?
The story is even sort of, it's a very plainly written story, kind of plain spoken. It has sort of the same increasing dread as the movie, but in some ways I do like the ending of the story better.
The short story?
Mm-hmm. But the movie, and particularly the second time, I don't mind the Pied Piper thing. And I thought about it a little more this second time. And I like the play, just a play in general, being sort of one of the last really normal things in the movie. And the way you see some of the adults starting to cry at the end, because they know it was also sort of a last gasp.
Yeah.
You've already heard that some of the kids are sick and weren't in the play. That in itself is really good. The Pied Piper thing, it's almost too subtle yet too ham-fisted in some ways.
Yeah, equally too Hamlin-fisted.
But at the same token, I mean, the message, again, like war stuff, just thinking of a war, big or on the level of, nuclear apocalypse, in terms of something that adults have subjected children to. Again, not every adult is like, we're not all coupled in the same way. I pushed the button, you pushed it. But in a manner of speaking, war is something adults have done to children. Right. So they're not, that's not wrong. I think it's okay. I think it works.
That's the hardest part about all of this, nuclear fiction that we watch from either an analytical perspective or from an entertainment perspective or any of this, is the worst thing you can have is you can scare someone and think this is awful and you paralyze them without really giving them some kind of sense of agency, a sense of hope, a sense of, well, here's what you can do about it. I think that's the hardest part with all of this stuff is you watch Dr. Strangelove and at the end of it, you don't know what necessarily you're going to do.
Or Threads to me.
Yeah. Look, there's there's time for those kinds of movies, and then there's other times for something that gives you a little bit of here's what you can do about it. But sometimes those can be a little bit hokey. The movie that I think of first is, we covered on the podcast previously, is Amazing Grace and Chuck, which is a story about a kid, again, who goes on a tour of to an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile launching facility, because they live in that part of the country next to an Air Force base, and they go on for like a school tour. He sees this thing and he's all scared about nuclear war now, and he decides to protest nuclear weapons by never playing Little League again. And he's a really good Little League player. He protests and it gets in the news, and start professional athletes, including a real-life professional basketball player named Alex English, who plays this guy named Amazing Grace in the movie. He decides that he's going to join the protest, and then it becomes international protests against nuclear weapons by athletes no longer playing their sports, and it's all around the world. And you see a little bit of that today when it comes to kind of social justice, Black Lives Matters protests with athletes, and the movie ends with nuclear weapons going away because the kids are able to convince. So then you think, okay, well, there's some positive there of people trying to...
That sounds kind of terrible, though.
But they're equally, it's a little hokey. But, maybe we need that kind of perspective.
Right. Using sports to do it. That's more convincing than some methods, to be honest.
Sure.
People love sports.
There's a lot of that, and I think that their Testament isn't really trying to do that. People can watch Testament and just be like, oh, this sucks, and never know what to do. But I think at least in Testament, there is a little bit of a feeling of, look at this community coming together. They're trying their best. Look at the impact this is having on this family, but they're still trying to hold it together. What can we maybe do to help them? When in Threads,
have this never happen at all. I mean, the sort of everydayness at the beginning is so perfectly done, where you wouldn't be interested in them really if this didn't happen to them.
Sure.
But then at the end of it, you're so upset on their behalf that their boring suburbia has been taken away, that their marriage squabble has been taken away.
Yeah, you wish that boring life on them, like you said.
Mm-hmm. It's like you want to prevent it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about it, but let's apply our rating system to it. We always tend to rate the content that we're covering 1 out of 5, with 5 being the absolute best and 1 being terrible. But I like to tailor the rating system based on the plot that we just saw, because I get super critical about the content. So let's tailor this. This movie makes it a little bit hard, given the kind of serious nature of it, to come up with which I usually try to make some kind of comical rating system, but I'm going to give it my best. Let's rate the movie Testament on a scale of 1 out of 5 attempts to pedal your bike up a steep hill. 1 attempt may not get you very much to make your bike enthusiast father very proud, but if you have 5 attempts to train yourself, you might just be able to make it to the top. How many attempts up a steep hill on your bike do you give the movie Testament?
I would say 4.5 out of 5. I love some halves. I don't know if that's
perfectly fine.
Complicating matters.
It's like at one point your bike your chain broke and you couldn't make it up all the way.
There you go. We're really working this rating system. Yeah, 4.5.
I would say too, 4.5. I like Testament, as I mentioned, a lot more than The Day After, which has a much higher budget and a more famous cast. But maybe there's some other stuff you'd rather recommend for others to watch or to read or something related to this particular story. I've got 3 things, but why don't you go first? What do you want to recommend to people who are listening to the show to check out next?
Okay, so the short story, as you said, is very short. Wow. Okay. But it's well worth a read, on its own, or especially in tandem with the movie. I don't know if you should put it in your show notes if you can. There's a link to.
Yeah, it's for free. It's available now. It's been around for a long time. It's open source at this point.
I wrote a thing about it for my blog when I watched it a million years ago, and I'm going to move that to my Shiny You website. But you can do a link to either one of those.
Okay.
Read my beautiful content
on the Stag blog.
Threads in The Day After are certainly worth checking out if you're sort of an aficionado at all, even less than you and I. Mm-hmm. And I always go back to On the Beach, which started my fascination with this whole subject. And On the Beach has sort of the waiting it out horror, but on a much more grander scale. And there's almost we know it's apocalyptic in On the Beach. And no one really expects to survive that. So it's bleaker, but there's still sort of the mindset, I think, is sort of similar. The movie is sort of more over the top. The book has a very, very to the point style, more so than even like the Testament short story.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, just definitely check those out too, even if the science will probably drive you insane if you know anything about it.
Yeah, they take a lot more liberties with radiation and sickness and in general.
And the complete lack of Australian accents on numerous characters in the film.
Otherwise, how are you going to get Gregory Peck?
Just they're not, you know what? Maybe not even trying is better than James Coburn in The Great Escape, who's like, I'm Australian, mate. I'm like, sure you are, buddy.
Right.
And also I'll add When the Wind Blows. Haven't watched the movie yet because the comic is so distressing, but just the differences in the mindsets and the preparation or lack thereof with this nuclear concept.
Great. Well, I covered that movie and story on our podcast recently when we did it with Sebastian Brixley Williams, who's terrific on all this topic, and he had that same thing. He loved watching and reading The Snowman growing up in the United Kingdom for Christmas, and then whoop. Then he also happened to grab this book out of the school kid book bin, and oops, a little bit different.
I thought the melting snowman was bad enough. That was bad.
So I've got 3 things here. The first is, if you happen to pick up the DVD for this, or if you have YouTube, there's a couple different extras on the DVD that they made for the release of it. There's one thing called Testament at 20, where the cast gets back together and they reflect on the film. That's pretty good. And there's also one called, I think it's like Nuclear Thoughts. It's another of the extras where they show this movie to a bunch of grade school kids and get their reactions to it.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, and it's pretty, it's good. I like it. I recommend the book. I've mentioned this so many times on the podcast, but I just love this story. The Road by Cormac McCarthy is one of the better books about a family trying to survive without really any information, with some kind of mysterious disaster that could be nuclear, probably not. It's a mix of a bunch of different stuff, and just trying to keep it together, and the choices that the father has to make with the son and the family, how it breaks down. It's just a really powerful, compelling story. And finally, I recommend the movie Airplane! The comedy.
So do I.
Why? Because we all need to laugh these days. But also, the actor that played the kid in Testament, Brad, his name is Ross Harris, he plays little Joey in that movie. The kid that goes into the cockpit and has some of those famous scenes with the pilot. Joey, do you like gladiator stories? Or the scenes that I really loved a lot as a kid when he's with the co-pilot, who's played by the basketball player Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And it's clearly Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as a co-pilot. He's pretending not to be Kareem. As a Laker fan growing up, I loved seeing that scene a lot, and I didn't realize that was Brad from Testament. And also the actress who plays Mary Liz, her name is Roxana Zoll. She was in a 2000 movie called Ground Zero, which is about a group trying to stop illegal nuclear tests. I know nothing about it, but I'm gonna have to check it out. So these people have been in a good. This kid actors, even though they're not in 1,000 things, they've been in enough that you can see the quality in Testament.
Yeah, I actually need to do an Airplane rewatch. It's been many years, and I quite liked it. And I'd rather rewatch that than Testament a third time, you masochist.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Lucy, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. Appreciated the fact that you were willing to deep dive back into this. We'll have to find something for you to come back on again later that's not as sad and depressing. Maybe there'll be a new Fallout game at some point we can cover that's a little more light. Maybe not in 2020 we can get back into this and not just ruin our brains.
Yes, I was very excited to be asked on the podcast this time as opposed to the first time when I demanded to be on it. But I regret nothing.
I'm a pushover.
Or any film, no matter how depressing, I'm happy to come back.
Well, in the meantime, where can people find you either on Twitter or maybe your website? Where can people find some of your musings on these topics?
Well, the easiest place to find me usually is Twitter, which is just at LucyStag. My Border Gone Defunct Stag blog, I'm going to move over to just mywholename.com. You can put that in links if you like. And I really hope to get back into actually writing down some more of my nuclear and other apocalypse films and thoughts and shows and movies. Because I have a backlog. I haven't been writing as much, but I have always been just reveling in the disturbing, miserable content.
It never stops, too. You think you get it, and it keeps going, which says something about something, and we'll figure out what that is by the time this podcast is over. So thanks again, Lucy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or you want to tell us what we got wrong, either nuke-wise or maybe I messed up something about bicycles and bicycle enthusiasts, maybe I've offended you, a couple ways you can contact the show and complain. We're on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast. I've got a website, supercriticalpodcast.com, and we're also checking an email account, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer,
Lucy Steigerwald.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get supercritical about it. Have a good one.